There's a construction project happening right now in the Arabian Peninsula that most people have never heard of. It involves moving more dirt than the Suez Canal excavation. It requires drilling through mountain ranges that engineers said were impossible to penetrate. And when it is finished, it will fundamentally change the global energy system in ways that make the current Strait of Hormuz crisis almost irrelevant. This is not a theoretical proposal. This is not a planning document sitting in a government office waiting for approval. Construction crews are on site. Billions of dollars have already been spent. And the timeline for completion is shorter than most people realize. This is the $100 billion plan to replace the Strait of Hormuz. And it is already being built. The project is a pipeline network, not a single pipeline. A system of pipelines, pumping stations, storage terminals, and port facilities designed to move crude oil and natural gas from the production fields of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates directly to deep water ports on the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman, completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. The scale is staggering. The East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia, which is being expanded as part of this effort, already moves 5 million barrels of crude per day from the eastern province oil fields to export terminals on the Red Sea coast. The new extensions will add capacity to move an additional 7 million barrels per day to ports that do not require passage through Hormuz. The UAE is constructing a parallel system. The Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, also known as the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, runs from the Habshan oil fields in Abu Dhabi across nearly 400 kilometers of desert and mountain terrain to storage and export facilities at Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. When operating at full capacity, this pipeline can move 1.5 million barrels per day entirely outside the Hormuz corridor, and the expansion projects currently under construction will double that capacity within 3 years. Oman is building complementary infrastructure on its side of the border. New deepwater terminals at Duqm and Sohar are being expanded to handle supertankers that cannot fit through Hormuz, even when the strait is open. These terminals connect to pipeline networks that can receive crude from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, store it in massive tank farms, and load it onto vessels bound for Asian markets without ever approaching Iranian territorial waters. The investment in Oman's port infrastructure alone exceeds $20 billion, and that is just the Omani contribution to a project that spans multiple countries and involves coordination at levels rarely seen in the energy sector. The engineering challenges are extraordinary. The Hajar Mountains, which run along the UAE-Oman border, are among the most geologically complex formations in the Middle East. Drilling pipelines through this terrain requires technology that did not exist a decade ago. The rock is fractured, unstable in places, and prone to seismic activity. Standard pipeline construction techniques do not work. Engineers had to develop new boring methods, new materials for pipe construction, and new monitoring systems to detect stress fractures before they become catastrophic failures. The cost per kilometer of pipeline in this environment is roughly 10 times higher than it would be for comparable construction in flat desert terrain, and they are building hundreds of kilometers of it. The strategic purpose of this infrastructure is obvious. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Approximately 20 million barrels of oil pass through it every day. That represents roughly 20% of global supply and over 30% of all seaborne traded oil. When Iran closes or threatens to close Hormuz, the global energy market experiences immediate shock. Prices spike, insurance costs for tankers multiply, shipping companies reroute or refuse passage, and every economy dependent on Gulf oil, which includes most of Asia, Europe, and significant portions of Africa and the Americas, faces supply disruption. For decades, this vulnerability was accepted as unavoidable. There was no alternative. Gulf oil had to move through Hormuz because there was no other route to deep water ports capable of handling the volume. That reality shaped military strategy, diplomatic policy, and energy security planning for every major power on Earth. The United States maintained carrier strike groups in the region, specifically to ensure Hormuz remained open. European nations stockpiled strategic reserves to cushion against supply shocks. Asian economies built refining and storage capacity, assuming that disruptions would be temporary and manageable. The $100 billion pipeline network changes that calculation entirely. If Saudi Arabia and the UAE can move 12 million barrels per day through alternative routes, then the total volume at risk in Hormuz drops from 20 million barrels to 8 million. That is still significant, but it is no longer existential. Markets can absorb an 8 million barrel disruption with strategic reserve releases, demand reduction, and alternative sourcing. They cannot absorb a 20 million barrel disruption without triggering global recession. This shift has profound implications for Iran. Tehran's primary leverage in any confrontation with the United States or its Gulf neighbors has always been the threat of closing Hormuz. That threat works because the economic consequences are unacceptable to every major power. Close Hormuz and oil prices double or triple within days. Global trade contracts. Economies that depend on energy imports face immediate crisis, and the political pressure on Washington or Riyadh or Abu Dhabi to negotiate, to compromise, to concede becomes overwhelming. But if the Gulf states can export the majority of their production without using Hormuz, then Iran's leverage disappears. Tehran can close the strait. It can mine the shipping lanes. It can fire missiles at every tanker attempting passage. And the result is damaging, but not catastrophic. Saudi Arabia and the UAE continue exporting through their alternative routes. Global supply tightens but does not collapse. Prices rise but do not explode. And the political calculus that previously forced restraint on all sides no longer applies. China is watching this development very closely. Beijing imports approximately 10 million barrels of oil per day. 70% of that volume transits the Strait of Hormuz. A sustained closure of Hormuz would be an economic disaster for China. Strategic reserves can cover consumption for roughly 90 days. After that, rationing begins. Industrial production slows. Transportation networks face fuel shortages. And the political stability of a system built on continuous economic growth comes under severe strain. The pipeline network does not eliminate China's Hormuz dependency, but it reduces it. If Saudi and Emirati crude can reach Asian markets through Fujairah and Duqm instead of Hormuz, then a significant portion of China's import requirements can continue flowing even if the strait is closed. That makes the risk of closure more manageable, and manageable risks do not drive the same level of strategic anxiety or policy constraint that existential risks do. India faces a similar recalculation. Indian refineries process approximately 5 million barrels of crude per day. Most of that crude comes from the Gulf. Most of it transits Hormuz. A closure would force India to draw down strategic reserves, reduce refining output, and potentially ration diesel and gasoline to priority sectors. The economic and political consequences would be severe. The alternative pipeline routes provide a buffer. Not complete security, but enough redundancy that a Hormuz closure becomes a crisis to manage rather than a disaster to avoid at all costs. Europe's dependency on Gulf oil has declined over the past 2 decades, as Russian gas and renewable energy have displaced crude and power generation and heating. But European refineries still process significant volumes of Middle Eastern crude, and European chemical industries depend on feedstocks that originate in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The pipeline network ensures that those supply chains remain functional even if Hormuz is disrupted. That reduces the pressure on European governments to intervene diplomatically or militarily to reopen the strait. The United States is in a unique position. American crude production now exceeds 13 million barrels per day. The U.S. is a net exporter of petroleum products. Domestic consumption is not directly threatened by a Hormuz closure, but the global price of oil is set by global supply and demand. If Hormuz closes and 20 million barrels per day of supply is removed from the market, American gasoline prices rise just as sharply as prices in countries that actually depend on Gulf imports. The political consequences of $4 or $5 per gallon gasoline are severe enough that every administration since the 1970s has treated Hormuz security as a core national interest. The pipeline network changes that dynamic. If the volume at risk in Hormuz drops to 8 million barrels, the global price spike from a closure is smaller, still significant, but smaller. And a smaller price spike translates to less political pressure on Washington to deploy military force to reopen the strait. That creates space for different policy options. Sanctions, diplomacy, regional coalition building all become more viable when the immediate economic gun is not pointed directly at the American electorate's wallet. The construction timeline for this infrastructure is aggressive. The Saudi East-West pipeline expansion is scheduled for completion by late 2027. The UAE Habshan-Fujairah expansion is targeting 2028. Oman's port upgrades at Duqm are phased, with the first major expansion completing in 2026 and full capacity operational by 2029. These are not distant future projects. These are near-term completions. And the strategic environment shifts the moment the first phases come online. There are technical risks. Pipeline networks of this scale and complexity have failure points. A rupture in the Hajar Mountains section could take months to repair. A terrorist attack on a pumping station could disable significant capacity. Seismic activity, which is not uncommon in the region, could damage infrastructure in ways that are difficult to predict or prevent. And the more the Gulf states rely on these pipelines, the more attractive they become as targets for actors seeking to disrupt Gulf oil exports. Iran is aware of this vulnerability. IRGC officials have stated publicly that any infrastructure used to bypass Hormuz will be considered a legitimate military target in the event of conflict. That statement is not an idle threat. Iran has demonstrated the capability to strike targets deep inside Saudi Arabia and the UAE with precision-guided drones and cruise missiles. The pipeline network, with its above-ground pumping stations, storage tanks, and control facilities, presents a target set that is dispersed but not invulnerable. The Gulf states are responding with defensive measures. Patriot missile batteries are being positioned along the pipeline routes. radar installations are being upgraded to provide early warning of incoming threats. And new interception systems, including directed energy weapons, still in testing, are being evaluated for deployment at critical nodes. But defense is always harder than offense. A single successful strike on a key pumping station can disable a pipeline segment for weeks, and Iran has hundreds of drones and missiles capable of executing such strikes. The economic logic behind the $100 billion investment is clear. The cost of constructing the pipeline network is enormous, but the cost of a prolonged Hormuz closure is far greater. If the strait is blocked for even 30 days, the Gulf states lose export revenue measured in tens of billions of dollars. If the closure extends to 60 or 90 days, the losses become catastrophic. The pipeline network is insurance. It does not eliminate the risk. It makes the risk survivable. The broader geopolitical shift is equally significant. For decades, the United States guaranteed freedom of navigation through Hormuz because American allies and the global economy depended on it. That guarantee required a permanent military presence, carrier strike groups, destroyer patrols, minesweepers, and the political commitment to use force if necessary to keep the strait open. The cost of that commitment, measured in defense spending, diplomatic capital, and occasional military engagement, was justified by the consequences of failure. If the pipeline network reduces the volume at risk in Hormuz to levels that global markets can absorb without systemic collapse, then the justification for that American commitment weakens. Not immediately, not completely, but enough that future administrations will ask whether the cost is still worth bearing. And if Washington begins to reconsider its Hormuz guarantee, then every nation that currently depends on that guarantee must reconsider its own security arrangements. The $100 billion plan to replace the Strait of Hormuz is not a hypothetical scenario. It is under construction. The pipelines are being laid, the ports are being expanded, the storage terminals are being built, and when the system becomes operational, the global energy map changes in ways that have not been fully anticipated by markets, governments, or publics. The Strait of Hormuz will still matter, but it will matter less. And in a world where 20% of global oil supply no longer depends on a 21-mile-wide choke point controlled by a hostile power, the entire structure of Middle Eastern geopolitics shifts, the construction crews are working. So the question is not whether this infrastructure will be completed. The question is what happens when it is